Thank you all for coming out today. We're here today for a panel on misinformation in the upcoming election. This is sponsored by the League of Women Voters and the Pima County Public Library. My name is Matthew Landon. I'm from the Community Engagement Office of the Pima County Public Library. And today we're happy to bring you scholars to talk about this important issue leading up to the election in November. Both the Pima County Public Library and the League of Women Voters are nonpartisan. We don't promote or endorse any political point of view. We feel strongly that the topic of misinformation is a nonpartisan issue that needs to be examined and addressed. You'll see some examples of misinformation as we proceed through the morning today. This is an interactive forum. We're going to be taking your questions. Today, I will be moderating this event. Dylan Smith, the editor-in-chief of the Tucson Sentinel, was sick, and he's in bed right now, convalescing. So today, to your left is Jeannine Reily. Dr. Reily is a professor of the School of Journalism with a courtesy appointment in the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona. She has conducted research and has done educational partnerships and taught courses around issues of disinformation and misinformation during conflicts, post-conflicts, and humanitarian crises in a number of countries around the world. To her left is Yotam Shmargad. Dr. Shmargad is a computational social scientist at the U of A, whose research focuses on understanding how digital platforms shape social and political life in the United States. His research speaks to questions about how social media can both fuel political polarization and incivility, as well as extinguishing their flames. To his left is Kate Kenski. Dr. Kenski is a professor of communication and government and public policy at the University of Arizona. She teaches political communication, public opinion, and research methods. Her current research focuses on incivility in online forums and multimedia teaching strategies to mitigate cognitive bias. So, welcome. Thank you guys for showing up. I'd like to start with a piece of information that's in the news right now that's very controversial, and get each of your initial impressions of the phenomenon, like how did it start, how did it spread, what are some of the consequences of believing it. I'm talking about the story that Haitian immigrants are abducting and eating cats and dogs in the Springfield, Ohio community. Apparently there's a video going around showing someone eating a cat. It turns out that it wasn't shot in Springfield, Ohio, and the person wasn't an immigrant. The mayor or the city manager of Springfield has said that there's no evidence of this happening. This appears to be a piece of misinformation. What are your thoughts? From your academic point of view, how do you take a news story like this that's coming out, breaking, going viral? How do you absorb that? And from your point of view, how do you address that? Any one of you may start.
I'll start. And first of all, let me say thank you so much to the League of Women Voters and to the Pima Public Libraries for hosting this, and all of you for being here. That particular story is certainly, I guess, sort of typifies maybe in a sense where we're at right now with American politics, and it's problematic. Now, in the last 12 years, it's not the conspiracy has just started, but we made a shift around that time in which we went from deceptive claims about candidates, which were there forever, where the other side always believes the worst about their opponents, to more exaggerated stories targeting particular groups of people. And so that particular part, I'll just leave, is problematic and troubling and should, hopefully trouble us all. But I think it also shows the willingness of people to spread information when they don't have the facts. And so that's sort of the ease of social media, right? That you can share something instantly without adding commentary, and you can willingly believe it. And so I think that typifies the times. One thing that I think, of course, makes it even more troubling is that when conspiracy theories are propagated by campaigns. That becomes more troubling, because it's not just people in the background, doing odd things, and we should acknowledge that people post really weird things on TikTok and Instagram from both sides that are troubling at different times. In that particular instance, one thing that's interesting, if you didn't catch it in the news, the morning of the presidential debate, the Arizona Republican Party launched a campaign, and if you look at their handle, you can go on X, formerly Twitter, and see that they launched this campaign where they put up 12 billboards around the Phoenix area with the title, the slogan is "Eat Less Kittens, Vote Republican." And I think that there's something interesting here, because no idea if that was coordinated with different parts of the party, but certainly when you have that going up in an area in a swing state, and then you have a presidential candidate putting forward that idea as well, certainly there is going to be some resonance, because one thing that we know about people, and this is all people, we're not so good at checking sources when it's information that kind of favors our side. We're bad at that. And so that's a global problem. And so again, I think that this one is certainly problematic. The thing is, it targets groups who can potentially then become victims of other people who happen to believe it. And it's certainly something that we need to think about how we address in ways that are effective, but also, of course, consistent with the First Amendment.
Great. Yeah, and I think this is such a great example of, I want to thank the League of Women Voters and the libraries, by the way, and all of you for being here. But this is such a great example of the many cases that will come up, not only before this election, but also beyond it. And a lot of the skills that we know or can develop further and will develop further as ways to misinform increase, right? Because they will with different types of artificial intelligence, before us. But I think this is a great example of, first of all, the one thing one could have done with this when this came out would have been to have gone to any of the fact-checking sites, right? And they are really instrumental in disaggregating some of these claims that are out there, or checking them. That would be the best way to say it. And, if you went to, say, PolitiFact for that particular piece, you would see they had the Donald Trump during the debates statement. They had J.D. Vance, his posts, two of his posts on Twitter, or X, which is now X. They had another senator from Texas's post. They had the House Judiciary Committee. They looked at as many elements of this as they could. They found a New York Times article that disclosed one of the perfect examples of what, the perfect environment for this type of thing happening, which is uncertainty, a town of 60,000 people that had just had thousands of immigrants from Haiti moved to the city for the jobs that no one wanted. And so there was, a lot of uncertainty and maybe discomfort with the change in the environment, right? There were different citizens now now, that were a quarter of the population. So those were good things. They looked at the U.S. citizenship and immigration services. You saw the fact checkers at the actual debate calling city officials to find out if this had happened. And of course, things happen and they're not reported, but it had not been reported to officials. So the city of Springfield, there were 3 statements and meetings around this. And then the original, some of the other background types of things. So a lot of these types of things, and I'm going to pass it to my colleague, a lot of these types of claims end up going viral or picking up traction because they're very emotionally laden, right, on many, many different levels. So when we feel ourselves reacting in certain ways, that's when to check ourselves, but also when there's uncertainty in environments, and these types of things happen. So we have a lot of uncertainty around elections, sometimes our community, sometimes our economic situation, and in places where, that are really fertile for this, and rumors and things like that are like war zones and places where there's a lot of gaps in information. We're lucky we have lots of access.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. I will say that as a computational social scientist, I tend to look at this problem of misinformation at scale. So my expertise is not directly relevant necessarily analyzing the particular case. But what I was, nevertheless, I'm going to give you my opinion. So I think one of the interesting things that came out of this particular news story is that when it was mentioned at the debate, sound bites emerged that were then used at scale in places like TikTok, where many were remixing these sound bites about dogs and cats and pets to create songs and jingles and other forms of comedy. And that is the way that many younger folks learned about the story. So they didn't learn about it necessarily directly from any news source. They learned it because they had seen remixes and mashups of sound bites that came out of that. And it adds a kind of layer of silliness to something that's pretty serious. And that's a central quality of the internet, is that you oftentimes see silliness and seriousness combined. And one of the first things that I show my students in my class on digital politics is the coup in Myanmar that took place several years back, where many found out about it because there was an exercise video. There was a woman who was exercising while the coup was happening in the background, and military vehicles were pulling up to the government. A similar kind of combination of silliness and seriousness. One of the recent pieces of information I learned about this incident is that there was a picture going around of somebody holding a dead goose that went viral. That person ended up working for the Department of Wildlife and was handling a goose that had been hit by a car. There's no kind of proof that that person was an immigrant or Haitian, for that matter. And I think this is one of those clear cases where, we worry about AI and fake images, but even real images, when taken out of their context, can do a whole lot of damage. And so I don't think AI is necessarily the only place that we need to be looking in the future for where we're going to see misinformation heading.
Thank you. We're all susceptible to misinformation. That's something we should know. Kate, can you explain what confirmation bias is and what people should know about their own susceptibility to believing misinformation?
Sure, absolutely. So one thing to keep in mind, there's fields in, the field of psychology has an area that looks at cognitive biases. And what we mean by cognitive biases is that it's not something that's necessarily ideological, but it can end up with ideological outcomes. And so confirmation bias, as you see here, is we tend to look and select and choose to process information that is consistent with what we already believe. We also have other biases that make things complicated, because when we try to address this particular bias, try to do things like encourage people to look outside what they're reading, because usually we read from outlets that offer us consistent perspectives, is bias blind spot. And in this case, it ends up being that as individuals, when we're looking at the world around us, we might admit that we're a little biased, but we always think that everyone else is so much worse. This becomes quite the task when you're trying to get people to overcome confirmation bias. I worked on a project where we developed video games for the government to help train intelligence analysts on different cognitive biases so that they were aware of these biases. And the tension is that the more you train someone, their head begins to think that they are impervious to misinformation. And sometimes education can do the same thing. So the very tools that are trying to address confirmation bias can end up exaggerating our bias blind spots, which is a problem. So what do? We tried to train people on both at once, and we were fortunate we ended up putting together a video game that actually did a good job trying to target both of those things, but they're at tension with each other. And that happens with other types of biases too. So where this applies for misinformation, right? Polarized environment, we're already seeking for those anecdotes that confirm to us that the other side is stupid, dumb, evil, and both sides are doing it. And we have discomfort when we, seek out information that, challenges, our narrative inside our heads. And so that becomes the problem with misinformation. With misinformation, we are more inclined to believe what our side is saying, less likely to fact check it. And so we have, different groups of people fact-checking things from the other side, but not fact-checking themselves. Just one last thing, and it's just kind of the way we're made right now. We for the most part, there's other parties out there, but for the most part, we have two major parties. And so for most of us, we know that those are the two choices, and we try to simplify things. And so what people sometimes tend to do is they might disagree with their candidate on something that's important to them, but they're just going to dismiss that. And it's not to say that you shouldn't vote for your candidate because they disagree with you on something. It's pretty rare that we all line up perfectly. But there should be acknowledgement that at times the other side might have it right. And we as citizens aren't willing to believe that, and certainly the strategies from the party aren't willing to give in. There's certainly different types of legislation that have tried to make it through, but no one wants to give the other side any sort of credit, and that's a problem.
Thank you. Would you like to add anything, Yotam or Jeannine, about confirmation bias and our own?
Well, one thing that I do, and I think it's great for any of us to do, is to look across, read, watch, listen laterally, so that, rather than just going to one place and looking at one thing, to look in a lot of different places. And so I just have recently, not everyone's, likes to read news, but I happen to, and I kind of need to sometimes for my work. So I, have my favorite sites that I go to, news sites, but I recently, sadly, it's just been recently, have been trying to add in some other sites. And the reason is to see what other people are listening to and watching and hearing. Because we have conversations with people, right? And the best ways to have conversations with them, and we have experts here that can talk about discourse and, how to talk to people around mis and disinformation and things that are going viral that aren't true. But one of the best ways is to listen closely to people and to understand where they're coming from. And so anyway, so that's one good way to really to look at a lot of different places for information, if that's available. And unfortunately, some news sites now have a lot of them have paywalls where you have to, but finding free sites that are credible is also important. And then also the ones, every so often you can look and see which sites have been debunked as not, as been shown to not really be news sites. So that's the other thing. This is getting a little off topic from the confirmation bias subject, but also when you're reading or looking or listening laterally, looking at lots of different things, checking to see what kind of, verifying that this is a trustworthy source. So, I remember, this is a year or two ago, there was an organization that found 100 sites online that were not really news sites. So, even though they had news on them, right? So those are things to be aware of.
Great. I think that leads us into a question for you, Jeannine. What questions should people ask themselves when exposed to new and sometimes viral content on social and traditional media?
Did you want to use the...
I'm going to...
Yeah, okay.
What are some of the tools people can use to provide context for what they are seeing?
Yeah, there's so many. So one thing I would do for context, period. So for context, you want to, there's so many ways to figure out context, but you want to check what you're looking at to make sure that it's actually, when was it posted? What was the motivation, maybe, of the poster, right? So this is a very catchy little acronym here. I'm going to skip down. I've got some notes here. We use this in a class. Everyone pays attention to this, right? So currency, as I said, or another word for it that librarians use is provenance, which is how timely is the information. Have you ever reposted something that someone sent you and it was like 5 years old, or, that kind of thing, right? It's very embarrassing. So when was the earliest known date of this happening, and what is the importance of the date, or how outdated is it, right? So that's one thing. Relevance, R is for relevance, and you want to just analyze it for how relevant is this to the topic, right? Maybe you could ask that question around eating cats and dogs, too. The authority, right? Who is the creator of the information that you're looking at? A couple years back, I don't want to make this balloon, but we had a student come into class who said there was a mosque down the street from where our classroom was. They had a little article, it looked like an article, that said that there were terrorists at that mosque. So this is in front of the entire class. You don't want to, shame anyone or ridicule them. So we said, okay, let's look at where this article, we pulled it up, where it came from. So we looked at the creator, which was someone with a very sordid, odd past. We looked at, we tracked that person down and looked at things that were written about that person. And then we started taking the facts in that article. So the accuracy of the claim too, right? Where did this come from? What's the documentation for this? So accuracy is really important. Accuracy, I think we all have seen this when you're looking or listening to something. How many sources are there? And who and what are they, right? So if a plane crashed outside of the library, that would be terrible. Would you interview about the engine issue the hot dog vendor in the parking lot? No, that's not a very good source, right? And so I see when I'm doing this lateral reading in some sites, there's only one source, and it's like, who is this source, right? So that's really important. And there are lots of different, you can also bias what you're, a material could be biased by having all of the same types of sources, even if they're all authority figures, right? So looking at diversity and the types of sources that are being talked to is really important. What is the purpose of this? What is the motive, point of view? What is missing? And also, there's always, I don't want to say always, because but generally something's missing, right? It's rare that we know everything about everything. So asking that, and does the source talk about what might be missing? Those are some key things.
Thank you. This next question is for Yotam. Your work involves the spread of misinformation on private platforms like WhatsApp and Telegram. How is misinformation different between what's been seen on private platforms and platforms like Facebook and Twitter?
Yeah, so a lot of my work, and a lot of my interest is in tracking how we know what we know about misinformation and what data are available for getting a sense of the scale of the problem. And private platforms make it very difficult to study the spread of misinformation at scale. And really the only way that, that you can do it, because even the platforms themselves don't store the data, kind of the whole reason for end-to-end encryption on services like WhatsApp. Telegram works a little bit differently, but WhatsApp and Signal do not actually store any of the data that's running through their platform, making it difficult for researchers and government agencies to know what information is spreading. So the only way you can do it really is to ask people. You do ethnographies, maybe people let you into their private groups and you track what's happening, but that leaves you quite a distance away from being able to capture the problem at scale. What we know about the spread of misinformation at scale on public platforms is that overall the prevalence of misinformation is actually rather low. And this brings up this other side of the problem, which is all of the talk around misinformation has actually created an environment where oftentimes people will treat true information with skepticism. And so I would caution against treating any given piece of information that comes your way as probably not true, because that's not quite the environment that we're living in. We've also seen the rates of misinformation go down since 2016 and 2020. And the data that people use, that researchers use to analyze large platforms like Twitter and Facebook, a lot of that has been going away as a result of companies wanting to train these large language models like ChatGPT on the text data that they're collecting. They've kind of pulled back a lot of the data that traditionally, well, in the past 10 or so years has been used to analyze who shares misinformation and how often are people sharing it. What we do know from public platforms and studies that were done in 2016 and 2020 is that conservatives tend to be targeted with misinformation more than liberals. If you control for how much exposure there is to misinformation, conservatives and liberals are equally likely to share misinformation. But there is an ecosystem of, we're not talking about Fox News and Breitbart, we're talking about fake news outlets, outlets that seek to appear as real news but have names like abc.co.com and other kind of variations on what appear to be real news sites. And that a lot of those, at least in 2016 and 2020, were conservative leaning in the stories that they covered. And so one of the reasons why we see higher rates of sharing misinformation on the right than we do on the left is because they tend to be targeted with misinformation more. There are simply more stories out there that target conservative viewpoints with misinformation. And one of the issues that we've had recently as the data has gone away is that we don't know how consistent that finding is in recent times. We know that that's true on Facebook and on Twitter in 2016, and in 2020 you find a consistent cluster of conservative-leaning fake news websites, not real news sites. We're not talking about websites that you're probably all familiar with. We're talking about sites that have been put up to appear as true news, but do not have any journalistic practices that go into the detection. And so one thing that I would simply suggest, if you come across a piece of information that you're not sure how to evaluate, would be to Google the source and realize that if you're looking at a website that's abc.co.com, that may not be ABC. And so Google the actual the actual URL and see if there's something on Wikipedia or some other source that you trust about that news outlet. And typically, a lot of these fake news outlets will be revealed in a Google search as not being legitimate news.
Great. going off of that, I'd like to introduce the audience to a site called the News Literacy Project. And the News Literacy Project was founded in 2008 as a nonpartisan nonprofit building a national movement to ensure that all students are skilled in news literacy before high school graduation. It was founded in 2008 by a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, Alan C. Miller, at the Los Angeles Times Washington Bureau. And this is just one example of a place you can go online to debunk or to find the truth out about a piece of information that's out there. Rumor Guard is the News Literacy Project's ongoing effort to identify rumors that are out there and to speak to their veracity. I'm going to click on one and we will look at what they have to say about it. It's about Project 2025, and viral social media posts have distorted some of the content of the actual project. You can go on their site and click Learn More. And they take a quick look at the, if you can't read the screen, it says that Project 2025 is a controversial proposal to reshape the federal government launched by a conservative think tank. As it draws more media scrutiny, numerous false and misleading social media posts about its contents are spreading, including baseless claims that women will be forced to carry period passports. Let's look at the facts. It says, yes, Project 2025 includes proposals to eliminate the Department of Education and expand the power of the presidency to reverse government approval of mifepristone, a medication used to end a pregnancy. It says, no, Project 2025 does not propose eliminating overtime pay, which is something that went around virally. It does not propose a period passport for people who menstruate so authorities can monitor their cycles. And no, it does not propose cutting billions of dollars in veterans' benefits. So this is something that you might have seen online or in your social media. And a site like this is a good site to go to capture those rumors that are out there and they source their information at the bottom of the page as well. Do any of the panelists have any comments on this particular piece of information or sites like this?
There might be a PowerPoint slide on fact-checking sites too. This is absolutely great, and it's always good to also read laterally for fact-checking sites because the cost of doing this type of checking is, not every single claim ends up being checked, but PolitiFact is great, the NewsGuard is great, and you can put the NewsGuard, I think in your, it's a browser extension on your, if you have Chrome, you can add it on, so there's plugins for it. So the Associated Press, AP, Reuters, the Washington Post, factcheck.org, they have free fact-checking places. So if you see something and you just want to check, it's so much quicker to have them do it. And they really, especially if it's something that has gone, it's a very well-known thing that's being discussed. So that's really good. There are also some other tools there that you might want to consider using. There's if you wanted to look at an image, check something yourself. Well, first of all, backtrack a little bit. I didn't mention, but I thought it would be worth mentioning, Harvard has an implicit bias group of tests that you can take called implicit, I don't know if you like those.
I tell everyone to take them.
Oh, good, okay, not everyone, okay. Implicit.harvard.edu, so you can find out a bit different implicit biases that you might have, so that's good. And then also the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, known as MIT, has has a site for, it's called Fact Check 101. And let me see if I can do a little word search here. It's KSJ, as in Jack, factcheck.org. And it's a 1-hour little module that helps train you up. We use it a little bit in some of our classes. So those are a couple of tools that you can use for that kind of thing. And then there's a verification toolbox out there. So if you wanted to do your own, if you saw some kind of video or photo somewhere that you wondered about, the First Draft, has a verification toolbox where you can put the date and time. Like you could say election 2016, the date, and then find out what the weather is. And I mean, that sounds obscure, but, a lot of altered photos have, maybe a cloudy day when it was sunny and that sort of thing. So there are lots of little elements and things that you can check and lots of really great tools out there to do it.
Great. Kate?
If I could just add one thing. I think that the example of the menstruation, pass, is a really good example of, it'd be curious to trace exactly how that developed. But in my mind, I think it probably, stems in part from when people put up memes that are textually based, so you can't infer what the person means behind it. It's really easy for text, and you've probably done this like with your friends. Someone texts you and you get annoyed by it, and then you realize either they were joking or like you just didn't catch really how it was intended. And I think we've all probably had those things. Same thing happens right when you see a meme. You don't know if someone's serious when they said it or if they thought they were being funny. Sometimes it's just hard to tell, and depending on where you're at because of your confirmation bias or just where you're at in the day, right, you might interpret it differently. And I wanted to mention some work by Dana Young. There's a book, and I think it's entitled Irony and Outrage. And what she's done is she's looked at some characteristics of liberals and conservatives and put forth a framework. And it turns out that in terms of detecting irony, liberals are really good at detecting irony. Conservatives, not as much. The way in which conservatives operate, it's a different form of humor. It's outrage, right? It's an exaggeration. And so what I would be curious, and I don't mean to say I don't know because I have not traced this particular one, but in my mind, I'm wondering if someone, saw something against, Project 2025 and started doing the hyperbolated it up, and suddenly that gets traced. And so I guess what I would say is when we're thinking about these things and where they come from, realize that people interpret things in different ways. Mm-hmm. And we do know that on the hyperbole side, when we look at humor, that is more consistent with the way conservatives have expressed themselves. Think political talk radio. So it's a form of entertainment and a form of education. And then on the more liberal side, think of like, Jon Stewart and the way in which he has, communicated. It's two different forms. They're both trying to be entertaining and informative, but they also lend themselves to how we get these rumors when people aren't dissecting well what's someone's opinion, how did they mean this, did they mean it as fact?
Great. We have a couple audience questions that are related and kind of related to what we're talking about now. And the question is how do we have a conversation with folks when we believe something that they're saying is not true? How do we approach this phenomenon when speaking to other people, friends, neighbors, family, strangers? What are some of the things we can do when we're having our one-on-one conversations?
I'll start with this one. I think we're at a moment in time where if someone says something that offends you, that if you come out it aggressively and head on, which is actually how I prefer. Like I come from a family where my parents always had people from all sorts of political perspectives going, in the house at dinner parties, and so they would just hash it out. And so it was a part where we're not in those times at this particular moment in time. And so I think that you take a risk when you feel you're right and you take it. And there are things that you probably feel really strongly about, in your heart, you're right. But if you push it a certain way, the conversation is going to end. And the question is, do you want to be right and have the conversation end? Or do you want to try to open up as a long-term strategy a conversation about where things should go? And so I think the most basic way when you see something, and I do this occasionally, although I can get down a rabbit hole and spend way too much time on social media, but it's simply asking people, not unlike the questions that you put forth. So, where did you get that source? Why, do you tell me about that? Why do you think that's true? And just a lot of whys. And sometimes not even giving your own position, but just opening up with, and really try not to be snarky. You have to be genuine, right? Why? Because you're someone that, why do you believe, what you believe here, and where did you get that information? How many people backed that up? Just those open kind of questions, I think, are most effective. Now, they might not be the most satisfying to you because we like to win. I like to win debates. But it's not, winning is not necessarily, there's the winning the battle and winning the war, metaphor. And if you want to bring people together, I think it's through trying to be more open and more curious than gotcha.
Great.
That's so good. And just thinking about, that's such a perfect way. And and thinking about trust, which is huge with people and their beliefs and their perceptions and their values. If it's someone that that's actually an asset. They may feel more at home with you than someone like than even a news source, or maybe even someone who could be more credible. Although I don't know anyone who could be more credible than Kate Kenski. But I think, and also listening really well. Because people we appreciate being listened to. So you get all the information you can, and then asking those open-ended questions. So that's far from confrontation, right? Which we need so much more of.
Great. In what ways has disinformation affected public trust in democratic institutions like the press and the electoral process? I'm thinking about questioning everything that comes your way, like the existence of deep fakes and voice cloning. The fact that that's out there and that people can say, oh, that's just fake. How has disinformation affected public trust?
So if I could jump in again, because I've done a few studies on this with my colleagues, and so I want to mention Mo Jones-Jang from Boston, Dam-Hee Kim, who used to work at the University of Arizona but is now in South Korea, and Sang-Hwan Lee, who is in New Mexico. So we've done studies where, and it's something to tap into what Yotam said when he said that, we can't necessarily collect all of whether something is necessarily true or false, the misinformation. But what sometimes is more important are our perceptions. And so sometimes there are truths, and it's enough to have someone, I guess, just dislodge whether or not you think it's true. And so our studies, instead of studying actual misinformation, we study people's perceptions about whether or not they've been exposed to misinformation. And in a couple studies that we've done, it's the same outcome, which is if you feel that you're being exposed to misinformation, you become more politically cynical, so you distrust less government, politicians, institutions. You become more cynical. You think that the media is out to get your side. And you have less confidence in what your fellow citizens believe. And so in terms of consequences, we have this trust. So what happens when people are politically cynical? Well, the research tells us that people tend to disengage from the political process. And so, unfortunately, that's not particularly, I mean, there's other things that hopefully counterbalance that. You try to, instill civic duty and things like that. But the research is pretty clear that when we become politically cynical, people stop participating.
Yeah, just building on what Kate is saying about perceptions, a tangential research area to misinformation in political science has been misperceptions, and specifically misperceptions about what members of the other party believe. We tend to frame the other party as more extreme than it actually is on average. There are also things like meta-perceptions, which deal with how we think the other party thinks about us, and we tend to exaggerate what they think about us even further than how they actually think about us. Political scientists have been pretty concerned about something that's called affective polarization, affective with an A, because issue polarization has actually not been going up that dramatically among the American population. Issue polarization being what we actually believe about policies and what should happen. What has been going up is how we feel about members of the other party and the extent to which we dislike, personally, members of the other party. There's a neat book that came out not too long ago called The Other Divide, which shows this kind of polarization, affective polarization, the way that we feel about members of the other party, doesn't actually exist among the entire population, and in particular is especially high for people who are high political news consumers. And Eitan Hirsch, who's a political scientist at Tufts University, talks about political hobbyism, how in many people's minds, reading the news is a political activity and has, for many, replaced actual political activities like canvassing and helping with campaigns and volunteering your time. And I think we have to be conscious of the fact that just consuming the news may not be political engagement, and in many ways may actually be creating certain misperceptions about how we feel about the other party and how we feel they feel about us.
As a follow-up question to that, from what you just said, Yotam, what is the history of misinformation in politics? Has this always been there, or is it somehow worse now?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll give just my quick thoughts. The term fake news, we know, is almost 100 years old. It featured in a 1932 Harper's Magazine article on fake news and propaganda. Of course, the Cold War was filled with a lot of Russian disinformation, among other actors, and we've seen many of that persist into the internet age, with some of the tactics changing. One of the things that emerged out of the Senate Intelligence Committee hearings in 2016 or 2018 were the Internet Research Agency, which is one of Russia's main research and foreign intelligence operation arm, was creating fake accounts, oftentimes even posing as African Americans, for example, to try to divide the American population. And these trolls, Russian trolls that, as they've been come to be called, target both sides of the political spectrum. They don't just target the right, they don't just target the left, they target both and try to pull them in the extreme directions. And this is, I think, one of the reasons, possibly, that misperceptions about the other party has increased. And that's because we oftentimes ascribe real identities to accounts that may not be genuine, may have kind of ulterior motives to the reason why they're communicating the information that they're communicating. As the data have gone away, again, we've had a harder time tracking the existence of these foreign intelligence operation. Twitter used to give academics these data dumps where they would provide information about foreign intelligence operations that were coming out of Russia and Venezuela and China and Iran and other places. And as of 2022, when Elon Musk took over the platform, we've not seen any of these data dumps. So it's a little bit hard to track what these foreign operations look like in more recent times, but we should know that they're there and that the information that appears in our feeds is not always coming from a well-placed or well-intentioned part.
Go ahead, Jeannine.
Yeah, no, that's so great on the 1932 Harper's article. I didn't know that's where it first showed up. And also thousands of years back, or at least over 2,000 years, there have been tactics and strategies used to misinform or disinform publics. So there's a lot of track record, right, on what works and what doesn't. Of course, we're all changing as time goes on, and so what's sticky now and what's sticky before, is different. The big component is social media, right, and also other methods of moving information really quickly, right? So we're all kind of walking into a blizzard of information, so that's the big difference, that the pace in which we're receiving information that may not all be accurate.
Great.
And that's why the research that Yotam and Kate do is so important.
Thank you so much. We're going to switch gears a little bit. I'm going to combine a couple audience questions with a question that I had for the panelists. My question was, what are some of the impacts of misinformation and disinformation? The questions from the audience are, how dangerous can misinformation be, especially regarding the January 6th break-in into the Capitol, and also the targeting of immigrant communities in Springfield, Ohio, and around the country. Impacts of misinformation and disinformation.
I can take a stab at that. So I think one of the biggest impacts of bad information or mis or disinformation is health, safety, and welfare. So just thinking, in environments of uncertainty, let's say you're in a neighborhood where there are fires coming toward your house. If you're believing, this fake picture of a fire that's maybe somewhere else, or one that's coming toward you, it's important to recognize that it can affect everyday life. For example, today, or in the last couple of days, there have been some bomb threats in Springfield, Missouri, related to, at the schools, related to, the Haitian cats and dogs story. And so the concern around that, so people didn't go to send their children to school, right? There are ramifications of bad information like that. There are people who don't leave their houses when a fire is coming because they don't trust certain sources. And so that part, I think, if we can build back in our communities, talk about places that are helpful for, or have solid information, ways to get information, events like this. I think, because trust is so huge, and trust in all the institutions, political, judiciary, news media, has just, if you look at the graph since the 1960s, when it was a black and white world that we lived in, the graph, it's just dropping on the trust line, right? So we are responsible for building our community trust, in a realistic way. I think that is very important, because for the safety and welfare of our fellow citizens.
Great. Okay.
I'll just add that, I think it was yesterday in the Amphi district, there was some targeting about, that there was going to be violence or shootings, and the schools had to send out emails to tell parents, that these are unfounded. And so I think that this, has disrupted, education, and then you have administrators who have to spend time, addressing that rather than focusing on curriculum development or whatever behavior problems naturally occur in schools that are not, atypical day-to-day, because, students need guidance. And so we can see that. And I guess I would also add that, I mentioned that, people become, politically cynical, and that affects participation, so that's one way. And I should add, on some of our research, we have done a study where we conducted a study both in the U.S. and South Korea, and it affects people globally. I mean, that kind of that chain of the impact of perceptions of misinformation. And so just to let you know, it's not just the U.S., although, how we manage it, might be different. The last thing I'll add is that, ways in which it affects us are concerns, just reiterating, what was already said, and that there are concerns about people reacting in a knee-jerk fashion and hurting members of their community. And we have seen a rise with some groups being targeted because of these campaigns against particular segments of society. And that's been a problem before, but of course this misinformation proliferation of it makes it much that more hard.
Great.
Just to add to, those great comments and references to literature, also around election times, bad actors, if you will, or people with nefarious interests, do put out bad information on social media. And when we're in a lucky circumstance, there are people who warn, they call it pre-bunking, telling people in advance that because we may not know what the vote count is, on this day, there may be some people, if they hear about it or know about it, who may throw these ideas out. So people are prepared in advance for it, so that can help people in knowing. I've also read in other countries, in Mexico, where people were going to vote, and there were some messages that this just shows how insidious it is. There were messages going out on social media saying that these roads were blocked or that polling station was closed, right? And so those are other tactics that are used that we just have to look out for one another around to make sure that, there are just all sorts of things happening that we kind of, it's good to keep our eyes open. And I think in terms of people who are working in this sphere, it is good to, let people know in advance of things that they may want to be careful of or aware of in their landscape, so that it doesn't take them by surprise unexpectedly.
Thank you. Here's a couple questions that kind of circle back a little bit, but they go to what you're talking about. What are the challenges faced by fact-checking organizations in the current digital landscape, and how can communication strategies be adapted to better educate the public about recognizing and resisting disinformation?
I think that probably the biggest challenge for fact-checking organizations is that there's so much misinformation out there. And so they are making decisions, and those decisions may be criticized by, the side that isn't fact-checked as much as to whether or not the right decisions have been made. Because the staff, for each organization is limited. They can only do so much in a given day. And they will make, I would say, editorial decisions in a sense, much like, a newspaper editor, right? Where they get to choose what they're focused on. And in doing so, that can come to, a little bit of a backlash from whatever side was not featured on a given day.
Yeah, one of the things that concerns misinformation researchers is when a piece of fake news goes viral, the correction tends to not spread as far as the initial piece of news. And that's one of the reasons why we have these pre-bunking attempts. But I'll bring it back to what I was talking about earlier on with the remixes and the mashups of the cats and dogs, is that this kind of more silly approach rather than serious approach to debunking misinformation oftentimes is able to travel fast like misinformation does because of the entertainment value that is attached to it. And in addition to being able to spread so that many people are sort of aware of the information, it changes the emotional tone that's connected to the misinformation to a lighter tone. So, I talked about misperceptions of members of the other party. There are, of course, many misperceptions of, different genders and different ethnic groups that also come along with the rise of the internet. And a lot of the way that misinformation about, other groups spreads is through deep emotions like fear and disgust. I think we see some of that with the story that we talked about Haitians in Springfield, Ohio. We saw that with the surveillance of administration that we talked about with Project 2025. And so changing the tone and sort of moving away from these kind of deep negative feelings of fear and disgust that oftentimes drive the spread of misinformation can oftentimes provide a distance from the information that helps us evaluate it in a clearer way.
There's one thing, as Yotam was speaking, that political psychologists have come up with models of how people make decisions. And one model says that we learn from things from the environment, but we tend to disregard the details. But what stays within us is that either positive or negative toward a particular party or candidate. And so one problem is that if whatever message we saw evoked something that is, anger, fear, resentment, and it's later debunked, the problem is how we record it in our mind. Is that positive or negative? And so even if we get the correction, it's not like we get the correction and that same amount can go up or down like a thermometer, right? And so if that model is correct, what it says is we have all these feelings, and even when we receive that logical correction, the chances of it being traced back and affecting it in a fair fashion inside our brain is pretty minimal.
So that's another great point about first impressions and debunking, the effects of debunking. And there's also, if, fact-checking organizations before they get to fact-checking organizations, let's say something is percolating around that isn't exactly right, analysts often will look at how prevalent is it, or how many people know about this, because by bringing it out as a bad piece of information, it often amplifies it, and that might be what sticks for people. So that's sort of one of the risks with debunking, and they're continuing to study the effects of telling people in advance versus deconstructing it afterward, and what the benefits of both. I don't know if you want to, just the slide on the Institute of Propaganda Analysis. One thing that I think is great is all of us continuing to train up, but also our students, I had some students in a class, it was a 7.5-week class, who absolutely loved the class, not me, but the class material. And they were saying they wished, and this was kind of embarrassing but the good part was they liked it. They said, we wish we had learned this in grammar school. So this is the kind of stuff, we all know, so just having some general knowledge around when you hear political propaganda or people saying political things, often the most sticky and effective information is that which has maybe mostly true and one fragment of bad information in it. That's the best, one of the ideal ways to package it. So these are, we all know these, right? The name calling is a strategy. We tell students, and everyone really, and for ourselves, to learn some of the old, I don't know if any of y'all ever along the way learned the fallacy logics, fallacy, all the big fallacies, right? The logic fallacies. So, deciding, learning some of those are really great, and you can apply them. You can sort of take apart arguments. But name calling is really common in politics. Generalities around sharing information that doesn't have, it looks great but doesn't have a lot of evidence backing it. What do we also know? Standing next to celebrities or someone who's trusted, it doesn't have to be a celebrity. The transfer of us seeing these people next to this other person who's maybe communicating disinformation might make that person more credible. We know about the plain folks thing, your neighbor, right? Going into a diner and talking to people, believing people who look like us, right? Or any of us. And bandwagon is another one in the U.S. People like to be part of the winning team, right? And with elections, we see that a lot with public opinion polling. And so the thing to keep in mind are the margin of errors on the polls, right? When they tell you what the results are. And then there's other error, and maybe not trying to be on the bandwagon just because it says this person is ahead or that person's ahead. We know about testimonials, people talking up things. That's another. Card stacking is public relations, like a persuasion tactic, where only the positive things are mentioned, not the negative. And then fear appeals, which both of my colleagues spoke about, using fear, which is a highly, it creates high emotion, and talking to people about the bad things that'll happen. Often that is very, very persuasive if it gets to fundamental concerns that, people have learned or have been inculcated with.
Very great.
And I will say that these platforms are getting better at detecting misinformation at scale before it even hits your screen. And so Facebook received a lot of scrutiny in 2016 for some of the misinformation that was going around during that election. And as a result, they've put in place a number of third-party fact-checking agencies. They work with the International Fact-Checking Network, the European Fact-Checking Standards Network, and other groups to help identify misinformation ahead of time before it reaches the end users. And I think that's one of the reasons why we saw misinformation drop between the 2016 and 2020 election. Some place that there's a study that places that drop as going from 44% of misinformation exposure to 26%. At the same time, we've seen other platforms get a lot worse, both with the amount of misinformation that is going around and also the extent to which we can study that. And so Twitter/X is one of those places that has all but closed off the data pipelines that are available to researchers, making it really tough to know how much misinformation is spreading on that particular platform.
Kate, do you have anything to add? Okay. We have an audience question. Changing courses a little bit. This goes to my question about what can be done about misinformation. The $800 million settlement between Fox News and Dominion Voting Systems seems to have somewhat tempered a news organization's spreading blatant lies. How effective can similar lawsuits be in stifling news organizations and social media platforms for pushing misinformation?
I think all efforts, trying many different ways, that surely is one of them. But clearly it's not completely effective.
Yeah.
I would say that legal action is a good disincentive for providing misinformation, but at times the incentives for providing misinformation may be larger than the legal consequences, especially because of the fact that legal proceedings can take a long time to conclude. And in the meantime, we also want ways of preventing misinformation spread while waiting for the legal proceedings to come to an end.
Well said.
Yeah. Let's talk about the phenomenon of misinformation in general as it relates to elections in particular. Has misinformation this is for you, Yotam, to start. Has misinformation significantly affected elections in the past, and what are the most effective methods for measuring the impact of disinformation on voter behavior?
Yeah, so these are big questions, tough to get our heads around, tough to study with data whenever you're talking about the effects of one thing on another. Much of the data that comes out of platforms are correlational, and so we're not often running experiments on these platforms, making it hard to know what the cause of something is. But there have been a number of studies about Facebook that came out last year in 2023, several experiments that tried to get at the effect of different kinds of interventions that academics could place inside of Facebook to see if they could change political attitudes and beliefs. And pretty consistently, they showed that they can't. So they tried things like changing the algorithm around so that it's less about engagement that's fueling the algorithm. They've tried things like making it less likely that you receive information from like-minded folks, so opening you up to information from members of the other party. They tried a number of other interventions, and pretty consistently, these experiments are costly. They take a lot of time, but nonetheless, they can only still be run for several months at most. And so having these kinds of interventions for a few months did not seem to change people's political attitudes or belief in any significant way. So a lot of these things are kind of entrenched in a way that it's tough to know the effect, certainly of any given piece of misinformation. There's a wide literature on media effects, oftentimes under the paradigm of minimal effects, that the media has a relatively small role in shaping our political attitudes and belief, and that our personal connections and environments play a larger role in that. And I'll just cite one last study about foreign intervention specifically. So there was a study that came out around the 2018 Russian trolls that emerged from the Senate Intelligence Committee meeting. And social scientists tried to see whether interacting with these foreign intelligence operations actually changed your political attitudes and beliefs, and they could not confirm that that was the case. What they were able to confirm is that the people who did interact with those foreign influence operations tended to already hold more extreme beliefs. And so if you were engaging with a Russian troll, in all likelihood, you were probably either to the relatively extreme right or relatively extreme left of the political spectrum. And so the people who tend to be targeted or often see this information are already at kind of an extreme and can't really be moved in one direction or another necessarily. They're kind of already there. And so it's tough to know whether we're seeing more people in the center, in the political center, being exposed to information from foreign intelligence operations because of the data lack that I'd been mentioning. But so far, a lot of the evidence points to there is no simple solution, and that many of the efforts of the largest platforms to shift some of these political attitude and belief variables have failed.
If I could just jump in, just to add a little bit about this idea of minimal effects. So going back to the 1940s, starting with sociologists, large-scale studies were run. And the question, was, in terms of campaign effects, do campaigns change people's votes? And coming back to it, it changed very few people's votes, right? Because most people do start off with their enclaves, and that's how they tend to vote. But I think the important thing to keep in mind is certainly campaigns think campaigns matter, which is why they spend millions and billions like they do. I don't think there's any intention that they think they're going to change most people's votes, but they need to change the minds of voters in the key states where they're likely to win. And so that's all to say that it's a minimal effect because it goes through this route, but it's a minimal effect that can change who wins an election.
Great. What can be done about misinformation that doesn't involve censorship? There's talk amongst some people about the Twitter files and social media companies influencing what appears on social media platforms, and the sometimes situations where actual true things are removed from Twitter. How do you navigate this question for all of you?
I mean, really challenging. I don't have any answers. I feel like my answers are more personal than coming from an academic perspective. We have the First Amendment. We could operate when we talk about, slander and whatnot through the courts. We know that the chances of things ever being corrected aren't going to be corrected in time before an election takes place. That's a problem. I tend to think that some of it comes back to education, but this is a problem because, of course, I'm an academic saying this, right? It comes to education, but there's some things that I think that we've lost in the K through 12 that I would like to see, come back, but that does require money. And that is, we've seen a significant decline in things like speech and debate. Speech and debate's a great activity because you don't get to choose which side you're voting for. You prepare both sides, and hopefully you see the merits and you see like the degree of difference between them. So maybe the side that you're arguing for, isn't wholly right, but maybe it's the best out of two options. But there are limitations, and you recognize those limitations. So speech and debate, again, has experienced a decline. I don't know if Tucson actually has any schools that are active in the speech and debate, but it's a great activity. The university level in the Department of Communication, we do have an argumentation course. And again, this is hard, coming from an academic, because I know those are perspectives, that are concerned about educators being in positions of power that could then, change minds. I have teens, and I don't think we can necessarily assume that any schools are necessarily going to change minds wholesale. But I think that what we can do is provide students with tools to see that there are a wide variety of perspectives out there. And again, in our Department of Communication, we have this argumentation class, and so I run it some of the time. And when I run it, students go through the exercises that I did when I was on the debate team in high school. And so they choose the topics that they want to debate, we come up with positions, and then they have to argue different sides in class, meaning they have to be prepared on both sides, but prepare one side. And I tell them, I don't care if you don't believe in this position personally. That's not what you're being evaluated on. You need to defend this position to the best of your ability, collecting evidence. And so this doesn't really answer your question, but it's all to say, I think that's something that we've lost. And if there was one, if I could have a go-back moment, I guess I would like to see that become a greater part of K through 12, because I think that would teach some of the skills and maybe some appreciation for why someone believes something completely different than you do.
Great.
Yeah, the line between moderation and censorship is a tough one that's still being sorted out. Of course, there's a lot of speech that's not covered by free speech law. Can't yell fire in a theater. You can't make explicit threats under free speech. And oftentimes platforms are trying to deal with those kinds of threats. There was the arrest of the CEO of Telegram most recently, because Telegram is one of these private messaging platforms that does collect data on the messages that go around its platform. And the CEO was unwilling to make its data available to government agencies so that they could moderate some of the speech that was happening on those platforms. That would seem as a possible way to curtail free speech, but at the same time, they're probably also looking for things that don't constitute free speech. And I'll just say a last point is that free speech laws in the United States were not developed with the kind of global world that we're living in today. They were developed with a much more local information and communication environment in mind, and that a lot of what happens when you allow free speech on a global platform is that you get people who are not American posing as Americans and telling Americans what to believe. And that is a challenging problem that the forefathers didn't quite conceptualize when they were thinking about free speech laws.
Thank you. I don't want to leave this conversation without talking about an audience question that came up and a question that I had. It's about artificial intelligence and the future. My question was, how do algorithms reinforce my beliefs, and how can I see outside of my box or silo? AI and algorithms. Any thoughts?
I encourage everybody to create multiple accounts. When Twitter's data went away, and I no longer could analyze Twitter at scale, I started just trying to create different accounts that follow different types of people with different viewpoints to see how these feeds kind of evolve over time. It's a little bit hard to keep track of. You can't follow too many accounts, but I encourage you to do this exercise if you're interested in getting outside of your box, because what I oftentimes find is that there are intersections and there are places where the ideas do run into each other. There's not separate spheres of information that are disconnected from one another. They're all pretty connected in different ways, and oftentimes the ways that they're connected is that the way that things are contextualized, the same piece of information is contextualized differently, depending on who it is you're following that is talking about that information. And so if you're curious about what other people are seeing, try to pretend you're someone else and see what you come across.
And I would say, that's great. I would say for manipulated information, there's some types of AI that is generative, that follows your patterns and creates things to help persuade you. It would be, at this point, you can still look for some details that may not fit, right? So there's still techniques on, blinking of eyes and hair that doesn't quite look the same, or colors of skin, shadows and that sort of thing. But keeping up with, kind of the latest on if there's any way to visually recognize things, and also training ourselves to do that sort of deconstruction on things that seem like they just don't seem right.
I don't want to end on that's the last question. I don't want to end on a dim
I have
note.
one more question.
Oh, good.
So, yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. I think part of the problem is you all chose to come to talk, to listen and to write questions about politics. You're clearly committed citizens. And I think one of the really frustrating things about AI is it depends on, the burden's on the individual to use the tools. And, I'm not particularly hopeful that the wide swath of citizenry is going to do that. It's just an observation. The other thing is that the level and the detail of the fakes with the AI are becoming better and better. And so you probably, if you're on Facebook or Instagram, the architectural design ones where you're like, oh, that's so pretty. It's a house, purchased almost over the stream. It looks impossible, because it is. But again, we can detect those now, and I think we're really good about those. I think when it comes to voices, again, my concern is how we process information. And I think most of us, to try to dissect every single claim that we receive is a lot of work. And so it's something to be concerned. And what I hope is that as that AI develops, the detection of the AI hopefully follows, because I think things are going to become pretty hard in the future to detect the way the pace of the technology is going.
And I'll just say one more point about AI. AI can have an effect even if we know that it's fake. And so it's not that the only consequences of artificial imagery and videos and speech is that it tricks us into thinking that something is real that's not, but it also adds to the emotional content of the messages that we're seeing. If you see a picture, even if it's AI, the contents of that picture could still do something for you emotionally, even if you know that it's fake. And so there is this concern that even if we get really good at detecting AI, it just creates more visual information that we're processing as we're processing political issues.
Thank you so much. Finally, to close the conversation, I'd like to ask each of you to answer this question for us. What can I do inside this information environment, and how can I improve civil discourse, make a positive impact, and spread factual information? It's a hard one. Take your stab at it.
So one of the areas I study is civil discourse. One thing that appears to be the case is that how conflict avoidant we are shapes how we perceive things, for one, but also are willing to engage. And so I just offer an observation that those of us, and I would be in this camp, I am not conflict avoidant. I like conflict. Not, you understand, I like arguments. I like debating. I think it's fun. But I'm not necessarily typical. But people who are willing to just, this is what I think, out there, kind of get the lion's share of what people see. And maybe it's those who are listeners because I know it feels uncomfortable, but also need to say what they believe or what they observe. So that's one thing, is if you're conflict avoidant, just consider that your voice isn't being heard, and maybe it would benefit someone to hear your perspective. Second thing I would say is that, when we're thinking about this, is sort of the role that humility plays in political life. So one of my graduate students, Daniel Montes, is also interested in incivility. And he's looking at the role that humility plays. And so that's really our openness, and this is what I was getting at before, of listening to the other side. So, if you're someone who doesn't listen, and you can try in your heart to try to be open, I would recommend having conversations with your neighbors who have the political sign up that doesn't go with your political sign, and to start conversations where you're not actually trying to convince them, you're just trying to understand. And sometimes just asking the questions, I think, can benefit the process of civil discourse in the end, and maybe build some trust between you and those conversation partners. So maybe eventually they will ask you maybe if they haven't asked you where you stand, or what you believe, or so that we can get those bridges going.
Yeah, I would say take a breath, take a break. One of the things that COVID did is it normalized this environment where it's acceptable to be online all the time. You've probably noticed this when you're sitting in traffic and the light is green and nobody's moving. we used to talk about how the norms of discussion were different online and offline. The more time we spend online, the more some of those norms can shift from online to offline, so that we don't treat people in person with the respect maybe that they deserve. And so if you're getting into a heated argument with somebody, maybe just get back to them later. You know, you don't have to debunk in person necessarily. You can do a little bit of research about what people are saying, and then respond when you're a little bit more cool-headed. So taking a break, I think, is not a bad strategy. Finding a hobby. The internet is also good for a lot of other things, but politics. Yeah.
I love that. And, along with reading, listening, and paying attention broadly, I think that downtime is really important, given what we know about, stress and anxiety and high emotions being fertile grounds for being receptive to mis and disinformation, and then the ideas around, communication with people and listening to people who may have different views or may even be, be saying things that maybe are in fact not correct. Asking questions in ways that are, not like an interrogator, but as a friend or colleague or neighbor. I think will go a long way. So continue to try to build our communities and clean out, the pollution maybe in our heads.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Jeannine, Kate, and Yotam for being here today. I want to thank Sue DeArmond from the League of Women Voters for helping me organize this event. And have a blessed rest of your day. I will follow up this conversation with a blog post, which includes links to the recording as well as links to upcoming events at the U of A, and a September 28th election ready event online that you can sign up for. Thank you.